Our brother Robert Harris will be exhorting us this morning, and his subject is Lessons of the Harvest. And in connection with that, he has asked us to read Psalm 67. Psalm 67. God be merciful to us and bless us, and cause his face to shine upon us, Selah. That thy way may be known upon earth, thy saving health among all nations. Let the people praise thee, O God. Let all the people praise thee. O let the nations be glad and sing for joy, for thou shalt judge the people righteously and govern the nations upon the earth. Let the people praise thee, O God. Let all the people praise thee. Then shall the earth yield her increase, and God, even our own God, will bless us. God shall bless us, and all the ends of the earth shall fear him. So let's give our attention to Brother Robert on the subject, Lessons of the Harvest. Brother Robert.
Good morning. God provides the increase. God provides us in everything. And thus, we have sunny days and days like this there is no sun, and there's abundance of clouds, and the rain nourishes the earth. So in due time, in God's time, there will once again be a harvest in the land. God provides that harvest, and God provides the increase. We have a job to do as well. We are harvesters. We're called to harvest. But yet at the same time, we are being harvested as well. We are being prepared for that harvest to come, that spiritual harvest. I was reminded of harvest going through once you get out of the city for a ways, you start to see the rolling hills and the farms, especially in the area where I grew up. We visited over Thanksgiving. And what you see now is a countryside that is not active. The fields aren't being worked. In fact, it's quite quiet. The insects of summer have ceased to sing and make their noise, but it makes the birds' song a little more noticeable. Things are a little bit quieter, except for maybe a squirrel rustling through the woods with the leaves. But the land is quiet. But until just a few months ago, the land was bursting with activity. Plants were being grown, crops were being gathered, work was being done, hard work of the harvest. And because of that harvest, families would be provided for, we will have food to eat, but all of that increase comes from God. Just a few months ago, at the beginning of the harvest in spring, crops are planted. And there has to be some order in working the land, because if you start too late, things won't grow, and if you start too soon, things won't grow. So things have to be done in their proper order. But once they're planted, the fields need to be tended. They can't just be left alone and you just go along your life and the land produces its crop. It needs to be tended. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be weeded. It needs to be cared for. It needs to be fertilized. And then once that increase is finished, it needs many hands to harvest the crop. And in my teenage years, I helped my sisters, my brother-in-law's family, in their crops. And believe me, harvest is not easy work. Harvest is hard work. There's a lot of sweat equity comes from harvesting crops. It's done in the hottest time of the year, and going to the gym was not a necessity. But this was the time when there were tractors, but also I remember a mule. And if the mule was in front of you and certain things happened, it made you work a little bit faster to get to the end of the row. A lot of things come to mind. But there were no idle hands at the time of harvest. There was everyone was put to work. Everyone cared for these crops and bringing them in. If people weren't in the field, the others were working to create a meal for those who are working in the field. And work started as early as 5 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes went on later into the evening. And once the crop was ready, there was no waiting. It had to be harvested, and it had to be harvested then. So there are a lot of lessons that God uses in our natural life to teach us in our spiritual lives as well. God is mindful of these lessons. And although we mostly harvest from the grocery store these days, we do understand the work and the toil, even from a small garden, that it's required to have some harvest of even a tomato vine. We actively harvest physical nourishment, and God teaches us from this example. Let's turn over to Psalm 85, verse 12. The Lord will indeed give what is good, and our land will yield its harvest. God provides what is good, and because of that, the land does provide the harvest. If we seek guidance by the Lord, we not only benefit from a physical harvest in this life, we also play a part in a spiritual harvest as well. We should be actively productive in both. We're not exempt one from the other. If we're not farmers or caring for the land, we do have to provide for our families to put food on the table. So in that essence, that is a form of harvest. But we also should be spiritually minded in our harvest as well. One goes with the other. Whether we actively work the land or not, we should take the lessons and apply to our spiritual lives as well. Let's turn over to James chapter 3. And we'll read verses 17 and 18. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So we see that for a spiritual harvest, not a fleshly harvest, but a spiritual harvest, there's certain things that will help that harvest to grow, fertilizer of sorts. We need to be peace-loving. We need to be considerate. We need to be submissive, full of mercy. This is hard. Of good fruit, impartial and sincere. We need to be peacemakers who sow in peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. You know, as I said, the physical harvest of harvesting crops naturally is hard work. And sometimes our spiritual lives can require hard work as well. But we need to be considerate and patient and merciful and sincere and altogether peacemakers to sow this harvest of righteousness. that God wants us all to have. The seed that we sow is the crop that we will get. It's that simple. If you want peas, you don't plant corn. If you want corn, you don't plant peas. You have to plant the right crop, because what we sow is what we will reap. If we sow fleshly things in our lives, then that's what we'll get. But if we spend our times sowing spiritual things and doing it God's way and following the example of his Son, we will reap a spiritual harvest. There are many hands in this room, and we're all must work together to create that spiritual harvest. We have individual efforts that we do on our own, but as an ecclesia, none of us are exempt at harvest time from putting our hand to the field and gathering the harvest. All of us have gifts to give in this spiritual harvest. You know, having these godlike or Christ-like and godlike tendencies is not natural. But it's something that's imperative for us to harvest the right crop. Discipline is required. We have to get up sometimes early in the morning to begin our day, or maybe stay up late at night to have this spiritual harvest. And a crop is not grown for the benefit of just ourselves, but the crop is grown for the benefit of many. I see the joy that people give or they get when they have a small garden even, and they share what's been produced with their neighbors. They said, here, this is from my garden. Isn't that always the best vegetables, is one that's grown by a neighbor and gifted to you? And to see the joy that that person exudes as they give you that, or in David and Connie's instance, eggs. Gifting of the harvest is a very godly thing. But again, this is not just for ourselves, it's for others as well. Let's turn over to Leviticus 19. Verses 9 through 10. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over the vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another. So we see that in harvest time, Leviticus is telling us that during that time they were to harvest, but not pick up the harvest that had been dropped, or to glean to the end of the field, but to leave that for those that were homeless, or foreigners, or poor. This provided for them as well. And I know I've mentioned this before, but I think it's lost in our society that the poor and the foreigner had to go out and do work themselves. The harvest was provided for them, but they had to go and gather it. And this gave them a sense of ownership, a sense of worthiness, that they too were able to work to help to provide for themselves, understanding that this was someone else's field. It was ultimately given by God. So we see that in Leviticus, they were taught to be mindful of others. In our spiritual harvest, we must be mindful of others as well. And there's another reference in Deuteronomy 24. Let's turn to that. Verses 19 through 22. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Again, harvesting for ourselves, for our household, but also providing for others. And this should be our approach in our spiritual lives as well. We benefit, our ecclesia benefits, but those that we don't even know benefit as well. Hopefully those that we don't know, we will come to know and can also share our hope with them. Crops are not just planted and then harvested. As I said earlier, there's much work that needs to be done to have a productive harvest. You know, the vines will grow or the crop will grow, but if it's not tended properly, the harvest will be minimal. Weeds are pulled to keep them from robbing nourishment and choking out the crop. At times of lack of rain, there's irrigation that needs to be done. A lot of work that takes place before this harvest actually takes place. But ultimately, God provides the rain. Excuse me. God provides the increase. But we have to be careful. We too have thorns affect our spiritual walk as well. Let's turn over to Matthew 4. And this is something that really stood out to me recently in reading this about the thorns. Matthew 4, verses 13 through 20. Leaving Nazareth, he went up and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake of the heir of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. I'm sorry, we should be looking at Mark 4. That didn't sound right. Mark 4. There were some hard words in that passage. I'm glad I didn't have to read it all. Mark 4, 13 through 20. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? The farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seed sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. Others, like seed sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. So we see that the farmer sows the seed. We sow the seed. But we are too that seed that grows. And the thing about the thorns is that this is self-inflicted. we are willingly inviting thorns into our lives. It looks enticing. We've accepted the greatest gift there is. But then, and I understand this, the worries of life consume our minds. It makes us make wrong decisions. It can be deceitful. The wealth that we see the world have might be a greater desire for us. The greatest gift that God has given, that is his Son. These thorns can choke out that wonderful hope that we have. And we can, when they're small, feel that pain of those thorns, and we have an opportunity to rid our lives of those thorns. But oftentimes, that pain of the thorn might feel enticing or exciting, or might be something that looks good to the eye, but ultimately chokes out our hope and our faith. So let's be mindful of these thorns that grow in our personal lives, in our ecclesial lives, and all around us. Sometimes we need the help of others to help us to recognize these thorns in our lives. And we must take the initiative to rid ourselves of these parts of our lives that choke out this great hope that we have. But what is our role now? We know that our role when we are harvesting a crop is that we have to go out there and harvest the crop. It can be a hot day. It can be a long day. We might not feel like getting out there at the time that needs to be harvested. But yet the field does not wait. The crop is ripe and ready for harvest. And we have a job to do as well. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 9. We'll read verses 35 through 38. Jesus went through all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news in the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, send out workers into his harvest field." We are here to serve. We're here not to be served. If we're here just to be served, then we won't get much out of our faith. We are here to be servants because we were shown by Jesus that example. He served everyone around him, and thus we too must be servants as well. We must be mindful of our path that we take, but also be mindful of helping others along their path as well. The experiences that we've had might help someone else, and someone else's experiences might help you as well. So let us all work together to serve one another in grace, humility, and in love. With that, we can accomplish anything together. But also there will be some left for others, some that we don't know on the edges of our field. Let us be mindful of our brethren, but also those that are on the outskirts, on the perimeter, that can and need our help. Again, we are here to serve. Let us find that gift in our lives that allows us to serve. And if we don't feel like we're serving, let's find that opportunity. Because once we start looking, we start seeing. We start seeing opportunities to serve. It's always been there. We just have to open our eyes to the possibilities. And finally, let's go to Matthew 28. We all know this by heart, but these are some of the last words spoken by Jesus. And he was speaking to his disciples, but he was speaking to us as well. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Jesus is with us. Jesus is with us to the very end of this age until the time of his return. There will be obstacles that will try to prevent us from being a part of this harvest and being a servant and a workman in God's field that we'll have to overcome. And some we might have to overcome together. Some might be external, outside of our lives, outside of our lives. But some thorns might be internal, things that we struggle with individually, that we know that are there. Those thorns need to be rooted out. But ultimately, we want to work together, individually, as an ecclesia, as a brotherhood, to harvest and work in God's vineyard, to harvest that crop until the day comes when we see Christ return and we share in that time when, again, the land will be at rest. But now the harvest is plentiful, and it's our job to be working in it. Thank you.